Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Carolyn Ompron, and I'm currently the chair of the Osage group, which, as you're probably familiar with, supports all of Mid-Missouri with our activities and environmental advocacy. Um, so tonight we're having an electronic meeting instead of and telephone-based meeting instead of our in-person meetings because the national organization has asked us um, to suspend all in-person activities until after April 12th, and then they'll reevaluate it and we'll go from there. The reason I'm the speaker tonight, though, is we had another speaker planned for this evening, but she preferred the environment where she could have, be online, but also be partially have a live audience. So we will reschedule her. So for anybody that's interested in Nadia Navarette Tyndall's presentation on native edible plants, native to Missouri, we will be rescheduling that for the future. So while I'm doing my introduction here, let me share my screen. Oh, of course, I forgot to start my slideshow, so one second. All right, I had this before. Now I'm having.
Is there anything I can help with, Carolyn?
Oh, I'm just trying to remember how. Oh, there. I
Oh,
had it.
there you are.
It was bringing up the. Because you have to be able to. Can you see the slideshow, or are you just seeing the slide?
I just see the slide. Yep.
Okay. All right. So let me reshare again. So I did practice this, but of course, in the interim, I forgot what I was doing. So, all right, there we go. Okay, so our topic for tonight is to give an update. They had been getting some requests for this to give an update about the Columbia Climate Action and Adaptation Plan and the progress that's being made on it. And then also to broaden this out to be a discussion that would hopefully be of interest to communities besides Columbia. We wanted to talk about options for communities to get started with their own climate action. And the reason that I'm actually presenting this is I was a member of the mayor's task force in Columbia that helped develop the climate action and adaptation plan. And we worked on that for about 18 months, concluding with the adoption of the plan in June of 2019. And then now I'm chair of the new commission that's trying is working with the city to implement the plan. And I'll talk more about that later. All right, there we go. So the thing I wanted to start off with, though, is that it's really important for communities. And I also should say, for those of you who are new to a Sierra Club meeting, normally before we get into the presentation, we talk about some of the upcoming activities and maybe some of the volunteer opportunities. But because of the current situation, there actually are not any upcoming activities on the calendar other than the Earth Day Festival in Columbia, which is planned for the end of April right now, either on April 26th or May 3rd is the rain date. But that the Earth Day Coalition plans to make a decision on holding that in about another week. They're going to decide around the end of March. But as you guys know, based on the current numbers, it's not looking good. So that would be what we would normally do, but tonight we'll just get right into the main presentation here. So, and the reason I wanted to start off with this slide from the National Climate Assessment for the United States is that it's really important that every community begin to take action on climate change today, whether we're talking about trying to reduce emissions or trying to prepare for climate change impacts, because the future risks from climate change depend on decisions that we make today. So whether we're building a new housing development and we need to make sure that it's not going to flood in heavy downpours, or whether we're putting in new streets and we want to make sure they have sidewalks and trees to shade them. There's a lot of decisions that communities are making every day in their normal course of business that they may need to modify their approach to them based upon the future impacts that we expect from the climate change that's already baked into the system, and from the climate change that may happen if we don't reduce our emissions now. So that's why it's a really urgent activity, and I'm really happy to live in a community like the City of Columbia that got to work on this 2 years ago. But I also want to stress as we go through this that every city doesn't have to do something this comprehensive. I realize a lot of communities are much smaller and don't have the resources to necessarily put together this large plan. But each community can start where you are and start with a few activities, a few actions, and then go from there. And so we'll talk more about that after I've given an update on where Columbia stands. So, the Columbia Climate Action Planning process, this is the process that we used. Columbia, before we even got into this, had already started a process of inventorying greenhouse gas emissions just as part of the city's ongoing sustainability work. But as we jumped into the task force jumped into this work, we really jumped in at this point of where we researched climate trends. So we read a lot of these documents like the National Climate Assessment and other scientific reports and tried to find as much information as we could about what's happening in Missouri and even mid-Missouri more specifically, and about any kind of factual weather data we could get on the changes that Columbia was already experiencing. And so that helped us understand some of the risk that Columbia might be facing. So we looked at the changes and the impacts. Like in Missouri, we've already experienced a significant increase in heavy downpours, which means stormwater management and localized flooding are potentially bigger issues. We've already had an increase in the average temperature, so that means that we have to be more concerned about heat in the summertime for health reasons. So we studied all that and we did our vulnerability assessments first, and then those helped inform our strategies and actions as we adopted goals, and then we created an action plan. The and then once we had our strategies and goals and actions, and we held a lot of community workshops, or two major community workshops along the way, and also conducted a couple of community surveys, both to collect input and then to help assess some of the proposed strategies. And so all of that was factored into the final plan that we created and presented to the city council. And I'm happy to say it was unanimously adopted in June of 2019. Sorry, this keeps going forward on me. I have to remember not to hover over my keyboard. Um, so where we are now is really trying to move into the implementation phase. And of course, every implementation plan also needs to include the action to monitor and evaluate progress, and then revise re-inventory emissions so we can understand, are we making any progress or not. We have to constantly stay updated on climate trends because these climate changes are not static, and they're moving faster in some parts of the world than others. So this is something that we have to continually be performing this loop as we go forward over the coming time period of the plan, which is actually a 30-year time period to 2050. So one of the first things that we wanted to understand before we started planning actions was, how do Columbia's greenhouse gas emissions contribute to climate change? So fortunately, we did have a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. There's a lot of information on the internet for cities that want to get started doing this, on how to do it, from like the the Sustainability Network or from the EPA. There's information on how to get started, but you could also, if you don't have the resources to do that, you could assume that your community, might look a lot like Columbia. So, this is how our greenhouse gas emissions break down. The largest sector is, of course, energy, whether it's gas or electricity, industrial energy, residential energy, and commercial energy. And then our next biggest sector is transportation and mobile sources, and that accounts for 27%. And then we have smaller contributions from waste and water and wastewater management and processing. And one of the things that Columbia opted not to do was not to consider consumption in our plan, other than the waste that we produce and the process of hauling that waste to the landfill or the recycling center, recycling it. So, because it's really hard to measure consumption, and consumption would be, all the food we consume, all the electronics we buy, and get rid of, everything that we consume. And so, because that obviously is a carbon footprint, but that isn't something that we're measuring in our plan. So how does Colombia carbon footprint compare to the rest of the country and the world? And it wasn't as favorable as one might think, given that we live in a small to medium-sized town. Our per capita consumption, based upon our prior numbers in 2015, is 20.5 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per capita. And this is how carbon emissions are measured in carbon dioxide equivalents. Obviously, there are more greenhouse gases than just carbon dioxide, like methane and others, but it's easiest is to talk about it in the equivalent of carbon dioxide, and then metric tons is the amount normally used. So across the US, the average is, or the number is 16.5, and across the world, it's 5. And so we don't exactly know why Colombia is higher than the US number, but we suspect it's because Colombia doesn't have a great public transit system. We do have a public transit system, but it doesn't provide as comprehensive coverage as we would like. And so, we're comparing our cities that do have public transit. And, so most people here often get around by car at this time. So this is what our future would look like in terms of emissions without the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan, which we call CAP for short. So we would be around just under 3 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent was where we were in 2015. Now, Columbia has its own renewable portfolio standard like the state of Missouri has in total, but Columbia's is more aggressive, and where we have mandated as a community with a community vote that the city utility needs to be switching from coal and gas, other fossil fuel-based sources of electricity generation, to clean renewable sources like solar and wind, hydro, geothermal. There's a lot of different ones. So this dip without our climate action plan is because our renewable energy standard continues to advance for a number of years. But then you can see at some point our emissions start to grow again, and that's when our renewable energy standard times out, and we didn't have any more jumps built into the system. So you can see that basically without the climate action plan, even with a renewable energy portfolio standard that does not currently take us to 100%, we would be almost back to where we started in 2015 by the year 2050. So what we did was, one of the first things we did after we assessed our vulnerability was we set goals for where we wanted to go as a community. And so we wanted to set 2 sets of goals, one set for the community as a whole, and the other for the community, the municipal operations of the community. So, because basically the city council and the city staff agreed that it was appropriate for the city operations to be more aggressive in moving forward with changes and reducing emissions than the community as a whole, because obviously Columbia can control municipal operations more than they can, 100,000 citizens. So, but we set goals for both. So we set 35% emissions reduction by 2035, 80% by 2050, and 100% reduction in emissions. So basically, we would be living at net zero by that point, not producing any more emissions than our local community could consume through trees or whatever by 2060. And then the city goals, as I said, are more aggressive. It's 50% by 2035 and 100% by 2050, so 10 years earlier. And I will say that these goals were set before the IPCC came out with their guidance about reducing goals significantly in 12 years from the time they announced that, which is now about 10 and a half, 11 years. And so one of the things that we did was look at these goals and see if they could be accelerated. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. So um, so this is what the future looks like, oops, with the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan. So um, as you can see, we're starting at the same point in 2015, and we're showing the end date here of 2050. And you can see here the interim goals of 35% and 80% for the community at large. And then the various sectors of decrease are represented by the various sectors in the plan and also sectors of our emissions. And how we calculated this was this is the area where the consultant was really important to Columbia coming up with their plan. But as I said, this actually isn't required to do this, but it really helps you understand if you're planning enough action to reduce the emissions in the way that the scientists are telling us that we need to reduce them. So we were really happy that we are basically exceeding our goal with the current actions we have in the plan and their estimates of how we would be how our actions that we plan will what they will achieve. We're able to overachieve our goal of 35% by 2035, which is good because that's what the IPCC, the international governmental body, tells us that we need to be doing. We need to be cutting emissions even more rapidly than what we had originally thought. And then by 80% by 2050. And you can see here, there is a little slim line right there of a kind of orangey peachy color. And that is actions we would need to get to this point. We would need to come up with some additional actions beyond what we have in the plan. But at least we know that the plan is really going to get us a long way there, assuming our assumptions are true about things like being able to get people to convert to mass transit or get people to switch to electric vehicles or get people to have more energy efficient homes. So we had to make assumptions on a lot of those things to come up with this kind of a forecast. And if you have a question along the way, feel free to unmute your line and ask it. Or if you don't want to talk, you could type something into the text, but I actually can't see the text, so somebody needs to let me know if there's a question. So one of the things that was really important as a task force was to figure out how we were going to evaluate the many actions that were proposed. After the initial public workshops and input period, we had a list, a wish list of over like 300 actions to assess. And obviously, we can't do that many. They're not all going to be priorities. So we had to come up with a criteria for how we were going to assess that. And we, as a task force and a community, we chose to keep all of these criteria equal. Now, some communities might choose to weight some more than others. Like there was a lot of discussion on effectiveness, should be weighted more, or affordability should be weighted more. But we felt it was so important not to lose sight of equity, for example, that we kept them all weighted the same. And equity really is important because it's so easy when you're working on things like this just as our government is trying to do now to address the current emergency with the pandemic, it's easy to address the squeaky wheel and not really think about the people who often don't have a loud voice, which are vulnerable populations, historically marginalized populations. Oftentimes that's like homeless, low income populations, and so we needed to make sure that we kept that front and center and are thinking about, for example, if we offer an incentive for the utility company, for the utility department to, get people to be more energy efficient, it's really important to think about, well, are people who are low income and renters and those kind of people going to be able to take advantage of that incentive, or are you only helping, people with single family residences and, maybe, higher on the income scale? So those are the questions that we tried to struggle with. And, there are definitely ways that we can make energy efficiency incentives work for the whole community. We just have to make sure that we think about it when we're developing those. So we looked at effectiveness, how much is it going to help us adapt to climate change, or how much is it going to help us reduce greenhouse gas emissions? How affordable is it in terms of, affordability by our city? Might we be able to get grants, that type of thing? Could a manager do it within his existing budget, or is it something that requires new budget? Feasibility really meant, did we have the expertise in our community, or could we hire that expertise? I've discussed equity. And then co-benefits relates to our other community goals and objectives. So Columbia is fortunate that we have like a master vision plan, a strategic plan, neighborhood plans. And so we wanted to try and identify where something that we were proposing with the climate action plan would also help us achieve a goal for one of those other important plans that the community already has in the books. So as I mentioned, we did a couple of surveys, and the community survey results, this is some of the results that we got. Obviously, this was not the entire community participating. It probably wasn't even statistically valid in terms of the sample, but we did try and encourage participation. We publicized it a great deal. And so we got, of the people that responded, 83% felt it was important for Columbia to take immediate action to reduce emissions. 86% thought it was important that we prepare for climate change, those adaptation activities. And 83% thought it was important for Columbia to take a leadership role in addressing climate change. So the plan that we came up with, in order to get our arms around it, we divided it into these 6 categories: transportation, housing, building and development, energy, waste, health, and natural resources. And we actually had a subcommittee formed for each of these categories. And on our subcommittees, we of course had task force members, but we also pulled in experts from the city staff that work in each of these departments so they could help us build a plan that made sense for our community, that employed their knowledge of the community, and was feasible. They had a lot to provide input on related to feasibility and affordability in particular, given their experience and know-how. So the point there is that it's really important to do this plan with community involvement and with staff involvement, because you need both bodies of people to be on board once it's implemented or starts to be implemented. So I'm not going to go through the whole plan because the plan actually includes 161 actions in its final form, down from over 300 when we started. But I did want to share a few of the actions with you, and then give you an update on what the city's been able to make some progress on since June of 2019, when the plan was adopted. So one of the key areas is energy. As I mentioned, it's our biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions, whether it's commercial, residential, or industrial. And so we have some very specific goals here. One of the most important things we can do as a community is get our water and light utility to begin purchasing or generating 100% of the energy for electricity from clean renewable energy sources. And so that's something that's currently being worked on. Um, and the group that's working on that is another task force. It's called the Integrated Electric Resource Planning and Master Plan Task Force, and they are currently assessing options. And this is something that a utility has to do every 5 years anyway. And so it just so happened that it was time for that group to get started with their work immediately following when this plan was adopted. So they, took the goals of the Climate Action Plan and they've incorporated them into their work. And they're actually looking with the consultant that's helping with that project at 3 different scenarios, getting to 100% by 2030, by 2040, and by 2050. And they'll have, once this work is done, they'll have an understanding of the viability of that, of the cost impact of that, and what will make sense for our community. But the stress is definitely to try and to meet the goal of 100% by 2035. They just wanted to be able to show the trade-offs. And the good news is, I just read Columbia's the draft of Columbia's most recent renewable energy report, and the new wind energy contracts that we just have gotten recently. The cost of wind energy has come down so dramatically that it's like half the cost of a lot of the other energy options that are out there. So this is looking like this will be a good news story. Housing, building, and development is key because a lot of the energy that's used in our community is used in our various buildings, whether they be commercial, school buildings, municipal, or various types of homes. And so this is an important area both for adaptation as well as for emissions reduction. From the adaptation perspective, we want to make sure that our homes are going to be prepared and our buildings to be able to deal with any kind of impacts we might expect from severe weather, from flooding, from things like that. So some of the work that's going on with this is that there's currently a team, a staff team that's working on, it's called the Affordable Housing Team, and it's actually related to the Community Health Improvement Plan. They're working on not only affordable housing, but rental energy efficiency, home energy scoring, which would apply to all homes, whether they're rental or not. And then the city staff that operates the city buildings is working on further municipal facility efficiency improvements. Transportation, I indicated, we have 27% of our emissions from transportation today. And so there's already some parts of the city staff that have been working on this. And so some of the work that's been underway for the last few months is working on plans for how we transform our municipal fleet of vehicles from, the current gas-powered vehicles to most likely electric vehicles, and then also making the city more supportive of electric vehicles, such as adding electric charging stations to the public garages and other actions such as that. Waste is a smaller area of the plan, but this is an important area for reducing our overall carbon footprint. So some of our waste goals are just to reduce the amount of waste that goes to the landfill, to expand composting, divert construction and demolition waste from the landfill, and hopefully divert some of that more into reuse, because it's really important that we get the community not just to think about recycling, but to think about first reducing consumption and secondly reusing what we have, whether it's leftovers or something that can be repurposed. And then Columbia doesn't have as high a participation rate as we would like for recycling, and so we actually need further enhancements there. So the work that's currently going on in this area, though, is in the last few months, Columbia has been able to expand apartment recycling with getting more bins. So apartments can have recycling bins on site all the time, as opposed to one day a week. And also the Columbia Public Schools is currently engaging in a program. There, it's going to be a phased rollout, and they've started their first schools already, where they will be composting waste from the school cafeterias. So that's already in progress and will be rolling out to additional schools in the community in the coming year. So, one of the big adaptation areas that we spent time thinking about was health, safety, well being. And initially, when the city council proposed working on the plan, they weren't going to include adaptation. But the community members and Sierra Club in particular really encouraged them to include adaptation because there are so many impacts that already are going to be happening because of the greenhouse gas pollution in the atmosphere that we can't stop at this point. Even if we stopped polluting today, we would still experience climate change for many years to come because of the pollution that we've already put into the atmosphere. And a lot of these changes will impact health, safety, and well-being because they are, heavier downpours that can cause localized flooding. They're more heat waves that can cause heat-related illness and unfortunately death. There'll be more vector-borne diseases from ticks and potentially other vectors like mosquitoes. And there's also potential problems with more air pollution and problems with water quality, particularly from flooding. So we wanted to think about all of these things. Another area is a potential increase in demand for mental health. And so this is something that it's important for communities to start thinking about now, because it's not necessarily that any of these are easy problems to solve. You don't just, get more mental health people in your community overnight. So these are all things that we wanted to include in the plan. So where we are right now is, as I mentioned earlier, the Community Health Improvement Plan is another one of those big plans that Columbia has. That's it was the result of a lot of survey work and community input work to figure out how we could um, in, uh, basically improve our overall health as a community. And so a lot of our goals were able to be and actions were able to be included in this work that was already underway. And as part of that work, one of the teams that they formed was the Affordable Housing Work Group that I mentioned earlier. And so that group is already addressing some of the health and safety and well-being actions, as well as some of the other actions related to energy efficiency. And I didn't say this earlier, but energy efficiency, you will hear people continuing to talk about it because in order to reduce our peak demand and keep our energy demand from growing, we have to implement energy efficiency. And as they say, the cheapest kilowatt hour is the kilowatt hour that we never use. And so that's something that it's really important for the community to work on. And just as an example, a few years ago when I moved here, I've been in Columbia about, I guess, almost 10 years now, getting close. And when we first moved here, they were talking about having to add a new substation and these high voltage transmission lines, and everyone was arguing about where they were going to go. But the city's actually been able to avoid that because of the energy efficiency improvements that people are making in their homes and businesses, and that we all have experienced through the government's Energy Star program for our appliances and other electronic devices. So it really is possible to reduce your electricity consumption curve. And that has happened even as the population of Columbia has continued to grow. So that just kind of demonstrates how important energy efficiency is. And so with that, not only did we not yet have to put in those high voltage transmission lines that people didn't want, but we also have been able to not have to have like capital improvements to be able to produce more electricity. So okay, natural resources is another category. Natural resources are important for all of us, but it's also important for wildlife. One of the things that uh, that that potentially we're experiencing as we need to stay home more is that it's really good for our mental health to get out in the outdoors, whether it's to sit in your backyard or to take a walk around your neighborhood. um, being exposed to natural resources, green space is really helpful for our mental health. And this will be increasingly important as the impact of climate change begins to accelerate and more people accept that we are in for a world that is changed and is different. We're experiencing that now because of a virus, but we will be experiencing that more and more in the future because of the impacts of climate change. And so we wanted to make sure that we think about our natural resources in ways that one will, be there for us in terms of mental health, but they also provide us resources in terms of mitigation and adaptation. So natural resources can help with the management of stormwater. They can One of the things that we're doing is we can, by planting sections of the city and the right easements and right of ways, we can leave those natural or plant them in native plants, and that reduces mowing, which reduces cost, and it also reduces emissions. Uh, so there's a lot of different things that where these all come into play. Green space also helps keep your community cooler. So if you have green space, that helps with that, as well as trees. Everybody knows a good shade tree will reduce the temperature significantly under the tree versus standing in the sun. So this is all important to factor into what a community is doing. And generally, these are very popular. Most people love green space, and so it's not something that you're going to have to necessarily fight in your community about. So what's going on here? Columbia already has a lot of good work going on around the area of natural resources. And I mentioned one of the things that's happening right now is they're expanding native plantings in right-of-ways. And that's good for us because it beautifies our city. It provides habitat for pollinators and wildlife, and it reduces the cost of mowing and greenhouse gas emissions from mowing. The community is also looking at ways for promoting water conservation. They recently restructured the water rates so that they would, people who want to water their yard in the summertime would potentially be paying a higher rate for that than people who are not consuming that level of water. And also right now they're working on incentives for things like reducing your water consumption through low flow toilets, low flow shower heads, things like that. So that'll be coming. Of course, a big area of the plan is the need for implementation. You can't just plan all these things and not have a good implementation strategy where the plan will just collect dust um, on the shelf. And so we put some thought into ideas and strategies that would be cross-cutting across um, all of these sectors that I've been talking about, and how we needed to move forward as a community to get this implemented. So one of the first things that we recommended was, of course, this needs to be a priority for the city council, and that this plan needs to be established throughout all of our council priorities and objectives. And as I said before, the city council did adopt this unanimously, so we have really excellent support on our city council right now. And one of the mission of the task force we knew would end the day the city council accepted the plan. So one of the things that we recommended was that we felt it would be really important to continue to have a citizens commission drive the city to make sure that we kept the sense of urgency and community involvement, and provide accountability and drive that sense of awareness throughout the community. And so that was one of the actions that was adopted. And so I'll talk more about that in another slide. And of course, it's also really important that we adopt the CAP goals into the budget process, and that these goals be integrated across all divisions. And of course, some divisions are more willing than others. But fortunately, the new city manager that Columbia just hired is very supportive of this plan and is helping to drive this tops down throughout the city staff. And then we also need to strengthen not only the capacity of the city staff to take action, but also to support community climate action and have a greater capacity in our volunteer um, force that really is alive and well in the city of Columbia. So, so in terms of implementation, the city staff has formed what they call issue action teams, and these are across departments. So one team includes all people from all the relevant departments for a particular area. And so the teams they formed right now are clean energy, healthy housing, clean transportation, good stewards, and resource stewardship. And so those are teams, they are just started getting underway with their first meeting. I believe it was in February. So hopefully they will continue to meet via online meetings and continue to pursue their work, even though some of them are working from home now, but those teams are in place. Then the city council also established, at the recommendation of the task force, the Climate and Environment Commission. They actually took a commission that we already had in Columbia that was called the Energy and Environment Commission, and they re-swizzled that and reorganized it and revised the mission of that former group and created the Climate and Environment Commission instead, with a primary mission to help drive implementation of the climate plan. This is a voluntary group of citizens of the community and the county, and it is selected by a city council. I was really happy that there was, 35 applications for the 15 slots. So we had really great community support and a lot of interested people in joining this commission. We meet at this time, well, up into this month, we were meeting monthly. And once our meetings resume, you're welcome to join them. They are public and they're held monthly at City Hall on the fourth Tuesday at 6:30. And due to the state of emergency in Columbia, these meetings are currently suspended. And unfortunately, we're not allowed to meet electronically because of sunshine laws. But we will hopefully get back to meeting again soon. So before the committee had its first meeting in December. It took a while to get the commission formed and the council decide what they wanted to do with the commission and then go through the nominating process and all that. So we had our first meeting in December, and we've had a couple of meetings now. And fortunately, we were able to get through choosing some priorities for our 2020 work. So as I mentioned, there's 161 actions in the plan. Obviously, we couldn't focus on all of those at once. So we chose 12 of them that would be a focus initially. Now, this doesn't mean it's the only thing that we'll work on, because obviously, as other parts of the staff or other boards and commissions come forward with proposals, there may be a role for the Climate Environment Commission to play in weighing in on those, but these are the ones that we wanted to at least self-initiate. So in terms of implementation, it's really important that as we go forward, we start looking at all new policies and projects from the perspective of, are they helping us mitigate or adapt to climate change, or are they helping us make the impact of climate change and our actions toward it more equitable? And so one of the things that we felt it was really important to get in place quickly is a threshold for all criteria, for a threshold or criteria that all projects would have to be evaluated against. And so this is really important because, for example, if we're about to spend, $200,000, or I don't know what the criteria will be, but let's say it's $200,000. If we're about to spend $200,000 on something, we need to know if it's going to support these goals. If it's going to cause an increase in greenhouse gases, if it's going to reduce greenhouse gases, if it's neutral. We need to understand that so that we're not, and as a way to ensure that we're all moving in the same direction. We need to develop community leadership capacity and get the community involved in climate action. And so one of the things that is already happening in this area is the Sustainability Office was able to get a grant from a foundation for $10,000 to help us start a program of community action ambassadors, basically. We have recycling ambassadors today that try and educate the community on the right way to recycle and get more people doing it. Well, this would be a similar kind of program of ambassadors that would work in neighborhoods or other organizations to try and get community action going forward to address climate action. And that could take a lot of different forms. And so we've got this grant to help us get that program up and running. And then we also, of course, need both organizational and staff implementation capacity. And so there might be more grants involved here. We might be able to use, groups like, Volunteers for America, things like that. Energy is really important that we, to be achieving our goals, that we get the goal of 100% renewable energy for electricity generation put into ordinance. As I said, right now we've got a renewable energy standard ordinance, but it doesn't mandate a timeline to 100%. And so this fall, when we hope to have the modeling back for this three scenarios that the Integrated Electric Resource Task Force is looking at, we hope to be able to push forward with getting this passed through City Council. And then, as I said, we will be working over the course of the year, making sure that Columbia Water and Light is incorporating the goals of the CAP, both in terms of electricity and water resource planning. Housing, buildings, and development. I've already talked about a couple of these. We basically put in our priorities to get rental housing to a point where it will be able to meet basic energy efficiency standards. And this will be something that rental owners would have to do to get a new license for their rental housing. And this is really important for Columbia because over 50% of the housing stock in Columbia is rental housing. And this is also a really important equity action because so many people that live in rental housing are low income, no income, and they cannot afford high energy bills. And unfortunately, since a lot of this rental housing hasn't been, it may be old and was built before we had energy efficiency building codes, a lot of these homes can have high energy bills, and that's very difficult for a person of moderate income. So this is both a mitigation strategy as well as a equity strategy. We also want to implement energy performance rating for homes when they're sold. And this is a way of using the market to help show favoritism to houses that get a good energy performance rating score. If a home is more energy efficient, then it should be able to get a better sale price, and people would be more interested in that. And this is already starting to happen somewhat today, but by um, having a standard measurement across homes so that you would know that this home is more energy efficient than that one, it would help you be able to assess what you're paying for. And then also, of course, the municipal buildings need to take a leadership role in becoming more energy efficient. Transportation, what we're working on here, and we really haven't started this work yet. We just formed the committee right before we had to stop meeting. But transportation, we felt an important point to get started on early is revising our street design standards to prioritize making it easier for people to walk or bike or ride transit, as well as, of course, still accommodating vehicles. And this is important to get this done early because in a growing community, we're adding new streets or updating streets all the time. And so the sooner that we implement this, the sooner that we'll be able to begin to see these changes. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we want to start taking steps to encourage the use of low to zero emissions vehicles. Waste. Waste has been a struggle for Columbia. In the sense that we have had a lot of community pushback to something that many communities implemented a long time ago, which is roll carts. So we have to find a way to come up, a community-supported way to restructure our rates to get people to reduce the amount of trash they're throwing away and get them to, reduce their consumption, recycle more. And one way to do that is by not letting people just throw away as much as they want for, a standard fee. And so we'll be looking at ways to do that and, studying what other communities are able to successfully do. And then under the health, safety, and well-being category, there's a lot of community interest in supporting anti-idling policies, particularly around schools. Um, it is really bad for children's health to be exposed to a lot of idling gas and diesel engines. So this is something that there's actually community support to do, and so that's one reason why we put it on our priority list, in addition to, of course, producing near-term benefits for the health and safety of our children. So those are our 2020 priorities right now. I wanted to just talk about some of the things that individuals can do or are doing to support the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan. So one of our task force members is a photographer. So I'll give a shout out to Silver Box photographers for taking all these great pictures and producing these images for us. So here's an example of a community member who swapped out his old car for an electric vehicle. This is a family that was able to move into a new home that was built to be ultimately as energy efficient as possible. And as you can see here, they feel much less stress because they know that they will not be hit with high energy bills, and they don't have to go around covering all their windows with plastic every winter. This is a young lady who rides her e-bike so that she can commute to work. And Columbia has, for quite some time now, has been working on creating bike lanes and building bike paths. And so we have a ways to go yet to still achieve the full vision, but this is an important aspect to not only community health, but also helping us achieve our goal of emissions reduction. And then finally, this family, I didn't really talk about it, but one aspect of the plan is supporting the production of local food. There may come a time in the future where we need to depend on food grown in Missouri or nearby states rather than food grown in California or Mexico or other parts of the geography that could get too hot for growing some of the foods that they grow today. And so this is a program that helps people plant their own home gardens. And so this family is able to produce their own organic food and save a lot of money at the same time. And that's really one of the keys to getting going in a community, is to look for areas where you can take the actions that we need to take to be either mitigating or adapting to climate change, but also to save money, and look for that low-hanging fruit, because that's going to be a win-win for everybody. So this has just been an overview and an update of the plan. If you want to review the whole plan, you can download it at como.gov. You can actually just, enter something into the search box for Climate Action Plan. But if you want to go directly to it, it's como.gov/sustainability/climate action. We also have a dashboard, which will be the place where you can go and look for progress. That will not be that, because the plan itself won't be updated, but the dashboard will be with progress that's being made. And so that's at comoclimateaction.org/climate plan. And then you can also follow Como Sustainability on Facebook for updates from the Sustainability Office on the climate plan and other sustainability initiatives. So before I move into getting started in your community, I want to take a breather and see if anybody wants to ask a question about the climate plan. Let me unmute your lines for a minute. Oh, actually, I guess. Oh, here we go. Unmute. Okay, sorry. Okay, so you're all unmuted. So would anyone like to ask a question?
I think we're still muted. I just did my own unmute, by the way, Carolyn.
Okay, Jeff, I can hear you now. So I think I got it this time.
This is just super. It's really super. Could I get access to the recording so I could share with other people?
Absolutely. So assuming that it works right this time, I'll be happy to share.
Super. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
A lot to absorb just one time through, but it's
Yes.
great to see this.
Yes.
Kudos to you guys.
Thank you. It's a lot of work, especially
Oh,
we
yeah.
held something like, I don't know, 20 committee meetings in the course of like a 3-week time period to
wow.
try and narrow it down from those 100 action items to the 161 we ended up with. So. All right. Anybody else have a question?
I do, Carolyn. This is Ron. Do you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. You seem to be working very well with the city council there in Columbia. Are you having any opposition or resistance from other governmental bodies like Jeff City or Washington?
I'm sorry. Could you repeat your question, Ron?
Uh,
Are we having what?
Are you having any resistance or opposition from other governmental levels like Jeff City or Washington? Everything seems to be going very well, moving the same direction in Columbia.
We have not specifically on any of these climate action items yet, but it is something that we're sensitive to because I don't know if you're aware, but a few years ago, Columbia started having a discussion, and I will emphasize discussion, about possibly putting a fee on plastic bags at grocery stores or a ban on plastic bags at grocery stores. And the state legislature swooped in and passed a ban that said we couldn't, even have
Yeah,
a fee
right.
or a ban. So we are aware that the state legislature might decide to get involved. And one of the actions that we recommended that the city do is actually become more assertive about advocating with the state legislature for the policies that we want to see as a community. So.
Okay. Well, it just struck me as a good question because what you're talking about seems very progressive. And I'm not sure I believe that the state or federal government is like that.
Yeah, some of them are. Some of them are even more progressive than this, but not ours. So at the moment, but Missouri is starting to come around, and that's something that we can talk a little bit more about how to get started in your own community in this next section without, incurring the wrath of the state legislature or even having to worry about what they think. So,
Right. Okay, good.
any other questions before we move on? Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and mute all the lines again since I do hear some background noise. And then if you have a question,
Hello?
yes?
I was wondering about your survey. If you have an idea how many people replied to that survey that you showed earlier, 83%, et cetera.
I'm going to just try and do this from memory, and it has been a while now, but I believe it was around 960, something like that.
That's not bad.
Not bad, no. We were pretty happy
Okay.
with the results based upon the number of people that had answered prior community surveys.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh. Okay, any more questions? All right, if you want to ask a question, you can go ahead and unmute yourself. So you don't have to wait for me to take a breath. You can go ahead and speak up. So I wanted to, I tried to share a little bit as I went through that about some things for individual communities, but I just wanted to spend a few minutes specifically focusing on that. So changing the presentation a little bit here at this point. So, and I've talked about this, I probably should have included these definitions at the beginning, but I'll take a second now just to revisit this, make sure everybody's familiar with this, because as a community gets started, there's, a couple of approaches you can take. You could try and focus on mitigation, or you can try and focus on adaptation, or maybe you can do a little bit of both. So mitigation, just to make sure we're all on the same page, means trying to stop future warming. And you do that either by reducing greenhouse gas emissions or by taking actions that will remove carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And one way to remove carbon dioxide is, of course, by planting trees. So that's something that a local community can do. Adaptation is really adjusting to the changes from global warming and doing that in a way that protects people and places and then wildlife and that if those are things you're concerned about, which Sierra Club is, of course. Um, and what we mean by that is really actions to prepare for the impacts that we know are now unavoidable. Because as I said earlier, we are going to continue to have global warming because there is so much pollution already in the atmosphere. Even if we stopped polluting today, which amazingly, the world is such it slowed down so much, we actually have cut significantly back on our pollution, but we all know that won't last too long. So we will need to get back to taking these actions to change our lifestyles. So I wanted to start off talking with some policies that a community can consider that would really help drive mitigation. So really help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or really help be able to absorb emissions already in the air. And so first and foremost is really to commit to 100% clean renewable energy for electricity. And you can do this as a community whether your community has its own utility or not. And I'll show you some examples in the next slide of communities that have made that commitment, even though they don't own their own utility company like Columbia does. And I admit that's a big benefit, but you don't have to let it stop you. Building energy efficiency codes. A lot of communities they have not chosen to require new buildings in their community to be built with the most current energy efficiency building codes. Columbia was the first one in the state to adopt the 2018 codes. And these codes, if you're not familiar with them, they're recommended by an international body of people that understand these things, like engineers and builders and construction people. And so they recommend a set of codes, and then it's up for each. Since Missouri doesn't have a statewide energy efficiency code or building code, it's up to each community or county to adopt their own, make their own decisions on this. And so most communities are not on the current, which is 2018. And this is something that, the sooner you get it implemented, the better, because every new building from that point forward is going to be built with the new, better codes. And so this is like, the amount of insulation and the type of windows and not being a construction person, I can't even, elaborate too much beyond that. But it is a really important aspect of this. Frequently, when a community starts looking at building codes, you'll have the developers say, well, this will make the housing too expensive. But that is a false argument, because one, if people are going to have a more energy efficient home, then it reduces their utility cost over the time that they live there, which could be 2 years, it could be 30 years, it could be longer. And so having those lower utility costs over their life of the time they live in the property is very beneficial, even to people of low income. And then also, maybe it adds $1,000 to the cost of a home to put in these, and I don't know that that's the right number, but let's just use that as an example. So if you spend another $1,000 making a home more energy efficient up front, most people finance their homes over a 30-year time period. So that $1,000 spread out over the 30 years doesn't add that much to the person's monthly home payment. So don't let developers tell you that, this is not something they can do. In the past, they wanted to do stuff that was, they wanted to spend the money on things that were more sexy, like, granite countertops or things like that, because that's what people were caring about. And now, fortunately, the market is changing somewhat, and people are becoming more interested in having energy efficient homes. But until that just becomes like an overall mandate, it's important that we have the energy efficiency codes in place to require it. And it's also important that you have them for both residential, commercial, and multifamily housing. That when Columbia first went to higher level codes or more current codes, we did it for residential, but we did not, it didn't get implemented immediately in multifamily housing. And that was really unfortunate, because at that time we were having the student housing boom here in Columbia. And unfortunately, some of those new units are very inefficient, and students were encountering like $300 a month electric bills for an apartment. So it just shows you how badly things can go if you don't have these energy efficiency codes and you just leave it all up to the builder. So, so that's one. That's something that you can start on without having a overall comprehensive plan, and it's going to pay lots of dividends to your community in terms of saving people a lot of money on their utilities. It's important to encourage your municipal buildings to retrofit for energy efficiency. So, or if you're building new, then obviously you want them to build to new standards, but I'm sure most of our small communities aren't building new municipal buildings, but they can do things like retrofit for insulation, to put in LED lighting, to have more energy efficient heating and cooling systems. And so those are things that are worth the investment, and you sometimes have to get your city staff or city council to take a longer term look and make sure they're looking at the payback period for being more energy efficient. One thing that Columbia has done over the course of a number of years, and I personally value it, and I know a lot of people do, because people in my neighborhood are always out walking or riding bicycles, is plan for, if you don't already have them, plan for and add sidewalks, bicycle lanes, or paths. And so Columbia actually has ordinances that require sidewalks be built in new developments or any significant modification or reconstruction to a site. And so, yes, this does add costs, but it makes your community safer for pedestrians, and it makes it, healthier, because people will get out and walk more if they can, and it lowers emissions because people are willing to walk, to the store or to the neighbors rather than, take their car. Which leads me to the next point, which is you have to plan for how your community is going to develop. So you want to plan for how you're going to have your housing, where you're going to have your multifamily housing, where you're going to have the grocery stores or the pharmacies or the gas stations, so that you have shorter trips. So you can stay, like, for example, with the planning Columbia's done, I'm able to get most of the services I need on the side of town I live on, and only occasionally do I have to drive clear to the other side of the town for something. Um, and so it's important that as you're developing your community, that you're thinking about those land use patterns and reducing the need to drive. It's also important when you're doing development that you preserve trees. And this is both an adaptation and a mitigation, because trees, as we talked about earlier, they absorb carbon dioxide, but they also are important for adaptation because they help keep your city and your community cooler. So Columbia has ordinances which could be models for other cities where trees are preserved in new development. And they also require new tree additions, for example, along streets and things like that, when a new development is put in, because a lot of developments are going to have to take out a lot of the existing trees. Columbia tries to preserve 25% of a certain maturity of tree and a certain type of tree. But, we all know that developments are going to sometimes have to take out trees. And so it's important, though, that they be required to add trees back in and not just have these barren landscapes. Another policy is, as we talked about earlier, supporting this emerging electric vehicle market, because the easier it is for people to be able to charge, the more likely they are to get electric vehicles. And the faster we convert our electricity sources to clean energy, the better that is then for overall for reducing emissions. And so one of the things, like right now, is a lot of young people live in multifamily housing or rental housing. A lot of young people are willing to buy electric vehicles, but those multifamily apartments don't necessarily have vehicle charging stations. So that's something that, we need to look at implementing. And that's something, that you could, make a part of your building ordinances going forward. And then also, if you're building new public parking, look at adding electric vehicle charging stations. So this is a map of cities that have committed, and Sierra Club actually works to help maintain this map and get cities to commit to 100% renewable energy. So these are all cities that have committed. And Columbia's not on there yet because we haven't updated our ordinance. But I contacted the Sierra Club to see if we could go on there just by passing the plan, and they said no, not until we actually pass the ordinance. So the plan wasn't quite strong enough. But St. Louis and Kansas City, for example, both have passed ordinances to commit those communities to 100% renewable energy or electricity. And that's really important because both St. Louis and Kansas City are served by companies they don't own. St. Louis is served by Ameren, and Kansas City is served by what used to be called Kansas City Power and Light, but I think they have a new name now. So, but they're in what they call investor-owned utilities that are regulated by the state. So it is possible to go ahead and make this commitment, and then it's important to make the commitment because it tells those companies like Ameren that you as a community want them to move forward more rapidly with clean energy. So these are really important commitments. Columbia's mayor has also signed on, that he supports 100% clean energy. So, we're working towards it, but we just got to get our ordinance passed, hopefully later this year. And then this slide shows some of the communities that are already at 100%, meaning that they may still get some of their electricity from the grid to help them power, for example, nighttime electricity requirements, but they are purchasing enough electricity or producing enough electricity from clean renewable energy sources to offset all of their electricity needs for those communities. And Rockport, Missouri was actually one of the first in the country to do this with electricity from wind generation. So we think that of Missouri sometimes as being quite backward, but Rockport, Missouri was actually one of the leaders in the country. And then I wanted to just show this chart. This is an example of how the U.S. building energy efficiency market has grown and it's actually getting a little dated now because it only goes to 2016. But the reason I wanted to show this was to show how many local jobs can come out of focusing on energy efficiency in your community. Because in order for a building to be retrofit, that work has to be done in the community. So that's an opportunity for local jobs when you start, having not only municipal buildings, but potentially school buildings and rental housing and residences retrofit to make them more energy efficient. So now let's talk about some policies that would help with adaptation. And so one of the things that we're already experiencing here in mid-Missouri is heavier downpours. More of the precipitation has shifted to the winter and the spring, and we'll have drier summers most likely. So this all means that a community needs a focus on stormwater management. So if your community has not done any stormwater management planning or could benefit from doing more, this would be another area to start, that where you wouldn't have to put a whole climate action plan in place. You could just start with stormwater, because stormwater is an important thing to address, even if we weren't having climate change, because if you don't, then you end up with localized flooding. You end up with, new developments flooding out old neighborhoods. And so this is an area that's important to address, even if we didn't have climate change. And so some of the things that, like for example, that Columbia requires is it has limits on the amount of impervious surfaces, meaning that, water is just going to run off them like asphalt or concrete. And they also have rules about how much water can be displaced in new development. And so new development now, they have to build things like rain gardens, retention ponds, things like that to catch the water that's going to be displaced when a new building goes up. Flooding, again, is a super critical area. Scientists are telling us that what we used to call a 100-year flood is now going to be more like an every 10-year flood, or maybe even an every 5-year flood in terms of the probability of how frequently those level of floods will occur. So it's really important that we stop building new buildings in the 100-year or greater, like 500-year, 1,000-year flood zones. Some communities think that you can depend on levees, and I think all of us in mid-Missouri probably have enough experience with broken levees to know that's probably not a good idea. And one area, Ron asked earlier about the federal policies, and one area that this does come into play is in this area. We recently, Sierra Club, tried to stop the building of a new subdivision that was going to have 3 houses in the subdivision in the 100-year flood zone. And right now, the federal government allows you to build in the 100-year flood zone as long as you elevate the base of the property or the building like 2 or 3 feet above the anticipated flood stage. But all of those anticipated flood levels are just estimates, and they don't take into account land use changes that may be occurring upstream from your property. And so we tried to say, you don't put these 3 houses in the flood zone, because even if the house itself doesn't get water in it, the people's yard is potentially going to have water in it, every other year or so. And, that's not something that a homeowner wants, is to have your yard flooded. And then also there's the unreliability of exactly how high the flood level is going to get. And also the fact that once you build these properties in the flood zone, that now will displace future floodwaters potentially downstream. So people who maybe didn't get flooded before might get flooded now. So these are all things to consider. But what Boone County told us was that, well, we're complying with federal requirements, so we have to let them build it. So this is a mindset that, we have to change, is that the federal government knows all. And a lot of the flood maps are out of date because they haven't been updated for many years. And we're experiencing all these changes in not only precipitation rate and frequency, but what time of the year it occurs. So it's a really important area for communities to look at for new construction. It's important to start thinking about a plan to monitor and address the increase in heat-related illness and vector-borne diseases. And I know this will be really challenging for rural communities because we have the whole crisis going on with, rural health care facilities closing. And so this is all the more reason for rural communities to be advocating with the state and federal government to be making changes in policy to make sure that we have adequate health care in all of our communities, and not just in, regional metropolitan centers like Columbia or Kansas City or Springfield or St. Louis. So, because we do anticipate there will be an increase in heat-related illness, and there will be increases in vector-borne diseases from the changing climate. We talked earlier about supporting native landscaping. Columbia actually just recently changed the local ordinance to actually encourage people to be able to, and I don't know if it encourages, but it allows people to be able to plant native plants. Because, for example, if you have your yard, let's say you live in suburbia and you have your yard and it's full of native plants, your neighbor may not think that's terribly attractive. Because when they're not like at their peak and flowering, they don't always look so great. But it's important that, we be able to have those plants and understand that they're not going to always look like a Japanese garden. And so Columbia actually changed this ordinance so allow, if you have a yard that you're managing as a native landscape, as long as you manage it and you keep out invasive species and you meet certain requirements about not letting it encroach on your neighbor's property, then now you can do that. So we talked earlier about trees, and that's certainly a way that you can get started without having a full plan. You can put ordinances in place to protect existing trees and require new trees and street trees during development. Encouraging water conservation is very important. The forecast is that we will all have potentially have water shortages sometime maybe after 2050, between 2050 and 2100. Missouri is blessed with a lot of water, being a river state, but even in Missouri, we could end up with not having enough water for agricultural crops. So we do need to be conserving our water, particularly our groundwater, because it's not always quick to be replenished. And then another aspect is really supporting local food suppliers. I mentioned this earlier, but the ways to do this is, farmers markets and urban gardens, and just really promoting local food production to make sure that if we can no longer depend on some of these faraway places where we currently get a lot of our food supply, that we are able to do that in our local community. So those are just some ideas on how to get started in your local community. I also wanted to share a few actions that we can all do that will help support climate action above and beyond these community activities. It's really important that you contact your elected officials to request action. And this can be your city officials, your county officials, your state officials, the governor, the federal members of Congress, the president. All of those are really important. This is an election year, so I need to mention that it's really important to know which candidates will be supporting climate action and vote accordingly. Sierra Club will be making endorsements as we get closer to the upcoming elections about which candidates that Sierra Club has vetted as being, people who will take action on climate change and do other environmental protections. The other thing that's really important is to talk with your family and friends about making changes. There is what Yale has a wonderful climate change research facility at their Yale University. And one of the things that they coined the term of a spiral of silence, where, if you think that climate change might be, political or start a heated discussion, you might not bring it up with family and friends. But the truth is, most people, even conservatives too, if you're thinking, but not conservatives, but yes, conservatives too, are now concerned about climate change. And you can have a discussion about, things that you can do at home, that you can do at your church, that would be things, changes that could be made. You can request a speaker for a group or organization. Obviously, in the short term, that would be by electronic meeting. But once we get back to being able to have in-person groups, that would be an option. And there's several people in the community and across the state who are trained speakers that can talk about climate change causes, impacts, or solutions. And I can help put you in touch with somebody if it's, outside of my territory. You can write a letter to the editor. Obviously, you might not want to do that right at this moment, but you could write it now while you have some free time maybe, and then get it published, down the road a little bit here about why we need to be taking community action. And you don't even have to necessarily use the words climate change. You could just talk about the benefits to the community of some of these other actions that I proposed in terms of saving money, either for the community or for the individual ratepayer. Each of us can take actions to reduce our own carbon emissions. These are some of the ones that I pursue. And then I have a blog where I occasionally, not often, but occasionally post articles on things related to climate change and taking action. And so it's www.slowingclimatechange.blogspot.com. And there is one of the articles in there lists a lot of different actions an individual can take. And right now it's customized with a lot of the links going to the utilities that support Columbia, and like energy efficiency improvement incentives, or solar incentives, things like that. But that's something that if you want to have that source and then customize it for your own community, I would certainly be happy to share that source document, and you could take out the Columbia links and insert the links for your own local utilities. And so that's what I wanted to share with you tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute the lines again and see if there's any questions or comments. This is it doesn't have to be a question. If you want to make a comment or ask a discussion question, or that type of thing is fine too.
Carol, this is Jeff. I've got one for you.
Okay.
I've thought about various things for Jefferson City, and one thing that I think might have some potential, if we could justify utility scale solar strictly on economics. What are your thoughts on something like that?
Utility scale solar. Well, right now your community gets all of its electricity from Ameren, right?
Right. Yes.
Right. So you would need to, we'd have to look at um, if it would make sense, because that would be basically getting your community into the business of being an electrical provider.
Right.
And that might make sense. I don't know. But you would need to make sure that um, I just don't know the interrelationship between, like, if Jefferson City had its own solar and wanted to put that into the grid, and then also, if Ameren would be the buyer or how that would work. So there's these things called third-party purchase agreements that might come into play there. So it's something we'd have to do some research into to figure out the right dynamics of it, but it might be a possibility.
I think a key criteria here is it has to pay for itself right now to get a start on anything, I think.
Yes, and so I'm not sure solar is obviously solar does pay for itself in the longer term, but
Right.
I think there's some things that maybe are lower hanging fruit for Jefferson City than, perhaps jumping into solar.
Sure. And I'll catch you some other time. I didn't want to take up a lot of this call, but just that was on the top of my head,
No, it's okay.
top of
Thanks.
my mind, so I wanted to bring it up.
That's the
But
kind of
appreciate it.
discussion that we wanted to get into. So,
Hey, Christine here. I wanted to, your last slide mentioned efficiency changes to your home and whatnot to reduce your footprint. Are you familiar with carbonfootprint.com? It's a calculator that I used, and it seems to be very good at estimating your personal carbon footprint. It's very enlightening.
oh, thanks for sharing that, Christine. I haven't actually used that one myself. So,
Carbonfootprint.com.
other questions or comments?
This is Ron Brooks calling again. I have always tended towards reducing and recycling, but that's gotten more and more complicated, it seems, with the market not being profitable for recyclables. And the company here that has been recycling wanted to quit because they can't sell their products anymore. There's no buyer. And so the city of Ozark, Lake Ozark, has paid them to stay open just for the convenience of the citizens of that town, because so many want to continue recycling. But in light of where recycling has gone in recent years, rather than investing energy in that, are you more interested in moving towards more political efforts?
Yes,
Recycling takes a lot of time and energy, and it's very difficult to manage.
right. And it's really kind of an interesting situation, I think, because when you talk to a lot of people about climate change, the first thing they will leap to is, well, I recycle, or
Yeah,
I started recycling.
right.
And that is not the thing that's going to make the biggest impact. And so so it is something, it's a mindset. We've been drilling into people for years now that they need to recycle, and so they feel like they're getting on board when they start recycling, and it does help, because if there is a market for the recyclables, then an article or an item produced from from recycling has a lower carbon footprint than an article that's made from scratch, natural resources that have to be mined and shipped and all of that. So it is still beneficial where it can happen, and obviously we need to get back into having more markets for it here in the United States. But you're 100% right that there's other policy areas that, if we're going to put most of our manpower or our money into something right now, that it needs to go into these other areas. So for Columbia, our biggest hitters are, moving to 100% clean energy at our utility, and then also, really doing something about our transportation footprint. And so if we have to choose, are we going to put money into waste goals or these other two goals, then, from a climate perspective, we need to be investing in the energy and the transportation sectors.
Well, that's a conclusion that I've drawn as I listened to you tonight. I thought your presentation was well done.
Oh, thank
and
you.
Stimulated a lot of thought on my part as I've listened. And like I said, recycling has always been my go-to response too. But as I listen to you, I can see so many other ways that would be more effective and more efficient.
Right. So we don't want to quit recycling, but we have to add on now and get other people to add on as well. So
All right. Amen.
thank you, Ron. Anyone else? Okay, well, we're about at the end of the time that I had promised for the meeting, so I'll go ahead and wrap this up. It does look like the recording has been going, so hopefully I will have a recording to publish, and we'll figure out if we can do that on the Sierra Club Osage Group website and put a link on the Facebook page as well. So I really appreciate everybody's attention tonight. As you can tell, I'm really passionate about the subject, and I could talk about it for hours, as I have done. So I really appreciate your attentiveness, and thank you for joining. And if you have any feedback on the Zoom meeting, you can feel free to send me that as well. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a good night.
Thanks, Carolyn.
Thanks, Carolyn.
Thanks
Very
for
good.
hosting us.
You're welcome.
Talk to you
Bye-bye.
later. Bye-bye.
Bye.